Hey guys, Henning and Morten from Flipnormals here, and in today's video we are going to talk about appeal and how you can use this knowledge to really improve your sculpting.
So let's jump right into it.
Before we get into what appeal is, if you're interested in learning more about what we're talking about in this video, we just released a brand new Introduction to Sculpting series, which teaches you everything we are covering now and way more. So we have to talk about what appeal actually is. This is a topic which is incredibly hard to really explain and to also to understand, because it's not just like a tool you can just read about, or it's not something you can just...
Yeah, there's no like one single definition of appeal. You know, when we talk about in the past, when we've talked about design fundamentals, let's take color, for example. You know, there are very specific guidelines for how to do painting with color, how to mix color, if color is warm, if color is cool, color harmony and color balances. But appeal is sort of all of the design principles mixed together. It's color theory, it's gesture, it's contrast, it's shape, it's rhythm, it's gesture. It's all of these things combined into either a character, an environment, or even a whole universe.
The way I like to think about appeal is as a melody. Like in music, you have individual notes which come together to form a bigger picture. It's the same in art as well. You have all the different muscles in the body and they come together to form a bigger picture. It's not about each note sounding amazing. It's not about each muscle looking amazing. It's about the bigger picture they're forming and the harmony they are creating. Another thing as well about appeal is that we are not talking about something looking beautiful, which is appealing, and something looking ugly, which is not appealing. Appeal is, like Morten was saying, it's a result of all the design principles. You can have a really, really messed up character, which looks really appealing. And you can have a cute character, which is not appealing at all.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with stylization or something being cute. Like, there are two kinds of terms here. There's appeal within design, and then there's, you know, something looking appealing, something that you find pleasing to look at. That's sort of like the distinction I like to make.
So here we have a great example of exactly that. On the left, we have our trusted Spyro, and on the right, we have two gnarly guys from Dishonored. And they're both appealing, but they're in a completely different style. So no matter if you're doing this really gnarly old man from the Dishonored universe, or if you're doing something from a Disney movie, or it's a kitten or puppy, whatever it is, appeal is more of a universal concept. You can have the Xenomorph from Alien, which is an incredibly horrifying character, look incredibly appealing.
Yeah, the way I like to think about it is kind of like a stat screen in a character creator, where appeal is the end result. It's your end character. So, and like we mentioned before, having this amalgamation of all of them combined with gesture, silhouette, color, contrast, whatever you might have, you drag on the different sliders, you know, from 0 to 100 to define how much the character has of each. And then at the end of it, you end up with a certain kind of character look.
So practically, in this video, we are going to be looking at global gesture, internal gesture, shape variation, and silhouette. So let's get into global gesture. This is an example of a really appealing figure. I mean, it's appealing in all senses of the word. It's appealing in the sense that it's a beautiful sculpture, and also it's just a lovely subject matter. We are first going to be looking at the overall, the global gesture. This is the gesture which flows through the body. Whenever you're sculpting or really drawing or designing anything, you have to make sure that you get the gesture right. For something like this, it's like easy to find the gesture because it's so prominent in the actual sculpture. But for some of them, it might be a lot harder to find. But regardless of what you're sculpting, you have to get the internal gesture right, or the global gesture right.
And I think this is one of the first concepts that people encounter, especially for people who've done more classical figure drawing. One of the things that's always talked about is the gesture of the character or the figure, and sort of where all the weight is distributed. The way you can look at this figure here and see the see the bottom of the curve down towards her thigh and her butt. That's where all the weight sort of gathers. She's very light at the top, and then the curve, like subtle S curve that goes down to the bottom. And this is kind of the thing that everyone who's learning kind of figure drawing, they're trained to look for this.
Then we have the local gesture. This is more the internal shapes. This is essentially all the individual building blocks which form bigger flows in the body. This one is tricky to understand. This is where we're not necessarily talking about this specific muscle goes here and there. You're treating the figure very much as a series of shapes, and they have to work in an appealing sense.
Yeah, everything has to fit together without, like a common mistake beginners will make is they will split certain body parts out. Let's say, you have the forearm, the upper arm, the delts, the torso, the chest, the hips, the legs, and so forth. All of these things, you think of them as individual elements because it helps you build up the character in the beginning. So when you're painting or you're sculpting, it's very useful to split it into different parts. Now, where it gets tricky for a lot of beginners is once you come to sort of like a combination stage where you have to combine everything and make it one cohesive shape, that becomes really tricky.
Then we have another view as well on more internal shapes as well. This is stunning. Particularly, we're looking at the this area here. We're looking at his deltoids. This is something we see so many times, and this is a mistake I've done multiple times as well, where you make each part of the muscle very specific, and you really go in and you really just refine each part, and you end up with all this striation, and you have no idea what's going on. When, if you notice what the sculptor here is doing, it's one shape, this one beautiful cohesive shape, then it's broken up with just some indication. You also see the shape goes from here and it keeps just flowing from one place to another. It treats anatomy more as a puzzle of shapes coming together instead of treating them as individual muscles from a purely anatomical and medical point of view. You just get so much more variation when you treat everything as elements flowing together like so.
It's kind of back to what we mentioned before about combining different shapes. Let's say when you're doing a figure, it's a combination of the forearm, the upper arm, delts, chest, whatever, all that stuff. It's the same thing with individual muscles. How often a muscle will have multiple muscles combining into one shape. Like the deltoid, I think, is a great example where it's comprised of 3 heads. You have the rear, the mid, and the frontal part of the deltoid, but most often you don't need to see clear striations in a muscles that's so defined. You're just worried about the surface, that the sort of surface anatomy and what it does to the shape of the overall character.
Next up, we have shape variation. And what better to look at than Pikachu and the evolving design of Pikachu. This is a really interesting design. There's so much we can talk about. We're probably going to dedicate a whole video to this in the future. One specific thing we want to look at in this specific design is tapering. That means that a shape, instead of doing this, does that. It goes from big to small. If you add tapering to your designs, to your shapes will generally feel more appealing. Now, don't overdo this. Don't make every single shape taper, but in general, it's a good idea to keep in mind. We have a few tapering shapes here. If you look at the old Pikachu and the new Pikachu, one of the things we're seeing is that the shape tapers a lot more. This gets a lot bigger towards the end. Well, here it retains mostly the same size. It's one of these tools you can use to refine your design and just make it stronger.
Yeah, and looking at this is where it's hard to define appeal as just one thing, right? Because you look at the tail and see how it's tapering. Now, this brings a lot of different things, or it takes from a lot of design elements. There's tapering, there's shape variation. It creates contrast in the form of Pikachu is generally soft, but his tail is hard. It's shape variation in terms of size, how it goes from big to small. It's straight versus the curve on Pikachu's legs. So it's a combination of a lot of different elements.
what I really enjoy about the new design is that we have two shapes instead of one. Here we have one shape, and here we have one shape. But here it's like Pikachu swallowed an egg, and it's just a really, really fat mouse. This design just feels more refined.
I love how they made a ball sack appealing. You know, at the bottom of the legs of the Pikachu on the right, that's a ball sack, and on the left it's an egg with legs. Right, but it's the variation in that shape that something isn't just an oval or something isn't just round. There's more things happening within the silhouette.
We can also see this when it comes to the ears as well. These ears are almost entirely triangular. Well, these ears are way more like this. It just makes it more appealing. If you want your character to feel more evil, give them triangle ears. If you want to make it feel more playful, give them ears like this. It just feels like this design hasn't really been thought out in the same way. This has just been refined significantly since this little guy.
It's crazy how a subtle change, like something that's purely triangular to something that's, I don't know, leaf shaped, or I guess, it creates more personality within the character. Usually when you see these types of cute looking characters, it's sort of the size of the eyes or the way they draw the eyes that makes them more cute, more appealing, if you will. But for this example, I mean, they have the exact same eyes, those soulless, dead eyes that's just like, I'm gonna kill you. But the one on the right, just it has a little more expression, but overall it has more, I guess, human elements to it. It's not just a single shape. And that variation in shape really helps give it more personality and make it more appealing.
Next up, we have silhouette and negative space. The characters, the three characters to the right, these guys, they're all from The Incredibles. And if you've seen the movies, you can instantly recognize who they are. There's just no debate if who this guy is, who this girl is, and who this guy is. You just instantly read, which makes it so powerful as a tool. This is something you need to think about whenever you are sculpting. First off, the character design needs to read. You need to see who they are, but also the shapes needs to be strong. This is something we always think about when we're sculpting. Make the shapes strong. Then we have generic Disney princess on the very left.
Yeah, I mean, her silhouette is still exciting because she's a combination of all the elements we've talked about, where you've got some straight, some curve elements. You have tapering in both from the hips down to the legs, but also from the hips up, going up towards her chest. There's a lot of interest being created, and there's like a little point poking out from the face, the hair. So a lot of these things come together to create a more cohesive concept. I think one of my favorites is definitely Edna Mode from The Incredibles, because she's so recognizable, even in silhouette form, without her glasses, her little weird nose and teeth, whatever it is, like her bangs, the way she holds her cigarette, the combination of like this kind of large head with tiny, tiny feet just creates a really interesting silhouette, because there's a lot of contrast within the shapes here.
And even if you're doing something more realistic, which is what I mostly focus on, you can still look at these designs and you can take a lot from it. In this case, you're seeing how it goes from really thin to really thick to really thin to really thick again. These are things you can use when you are designing realistic characters as well. Muscles and arms and fingers generally go from thick to thin. And if you're very deliberate about that, you will just have a stronger design, and then you take it back to a more realistic point of view based on the anatomy.
You can kind of think of it when it comes to muscles and anatomy. The sort of muscle belly of any given muscle will always have more volume one place compared to another. Maybe it's in the center, like the bicep, right? It's most of the time it's got more mass in the center. So it tapers from the beginning to the middle, and then it tapers again from the middle to the other end, I suppose. Whereas something like the thighs, for example, with the quads, has more volume towards the bottom, but less volume at the top. So it creates these natural tapers within the human form. So that's why it's very important to know about these things, especially when it comes to human or animal anatomy.
So now in ZBrush, here we have two models. The model on the left is a fairly refined concept sculpt, and the one on the right is one we have messed up properly, but it still fits based on a lot of student work we're seeing, where you're at a level where you generally understand anatomy, meaning that you understand it first. You have to block in the skeleton, get in some muscles, put on some fat, and then some skin on the top. You understand how to work with ZBrush, and everything should be there. But your guy, he doesn't work. He just doesn't look very good. So we'll try to explain how you can improve your characters using the tools we just discussed. So first up, let's compare the overall gesture. If we're looking at the guy on the left, his gesture flows through the body. And there is some cohesiveness to it. Everything kind of flows together. You see the shapes here in the silhouette. It just kind of flows like this. His arm flows down like this, and everything kind of flows together. Then we have Mr. Barrel Chest on our right, and this is where he does not flow one bit. It's very rigid from one spot to another, where there is no love in his gesture. And why is this important? Well, it's important if you want to feel natural. Everything in the real world has some natural gesture to it. This just doesn't exist. Even if you have a bad posture, there's still going to be some gesture in your original reference.
Now, it's important to remember that if you're creating a character who's, let's say, older, more feeble, kind of like a Scrooge character, older guy, evil, you can definitely have these breaks within the gesture, but it doesn't mean that the character has to be stiff in the gesture. It doesn't necessarily have to flow to the same extent like we showed with the sculpture in the beginning, the sculpture of the girl where everything sort of flows very softly into each other. You can have something has a hard flow to it, but you just have to keep that gesture in mind.
Like if you're doing somebody like the Hulk or Sauron, they aren't necessarily that dynamic characters. They're much stronger than something crazy dynamic. They still have a lot of gesture in them. If you're looking at the Hulk model, he will have all of the things we're talking about now down. Very dynamic gesture, nice silhouette, and all of that. We can also look at the shapes as well. If we break down the main torso shapes, we have some really nice shapes going like this. We have a shape going like this. And here we have one shape going like so, where you can see that it's the same thickness top and bottom. There's no difference from this, while here it's a shape which goes, it's bigger, then it's smaller, then it gets thinner again, then it gets bigger, then it gets smaller again. It just creates a lot more natural variation. If we were to simplify this down, it would be something like this and something like this. Well, this guy is like that. It's just about creating nice natural shapes.
Yeah, the guy on the right is more a rudimentary cylinder form, where the one on the left is comprised of some more dynamic spheres that has some width and some difference in them.
We can also look at this guy from a front view as well, and we have the same problems. Front view, he is very much a barrel shape.
Supremely stiff, no dynamicness, if that is even a word.
Nothing whatsoever. Well, the guy on the left, he is far more dynamic. And like we're saying, you don't have to make everything crazy dynamic. You might have a character who's supposed to be more barrel shaped. If you're looking like the Kingpin from the latest Spider-Man movie, Into the Spider-Verse, he's way more like a square, but he still has a lot of gesture and shape to him.
Yeah, look at the way, for example, if I remember correctly, the way he sort of transitions from his arms to his shoulder, the way it sort of like wraps around the traps, the way his head sits in the body. He becomes this basically walking wall with the limbs, but there's still a lot of variation in terms of the silhouette when it comes to him, which still makes it interesting. Like where this goes wrong is that it's kind of a combination of several things, where it has that blocky, bulky wall feeling to it in the midsection, but other parts don't really follow along, like the arms, the legs. They're still more agile, so they don't really fit the character.
You can also see here that he's so barrel-chested that you don't even have like the overhang like this. Here it's just all the same like this. So you really have to look at this from all views like this. Then we want to take a look at some more internal shapes as well. This is more how, for instance, the arms connect and all the different shapes we're looking at here. If we take this into Photoshop. Here we can see on the left, if we start to analyze this, it feels way more broken up. Here we have one shape, and then one, and it kind of goes like this. Then we have one shape, and it goes like this. That's a little bit wobbly. It goes like this, and it goes like this. And we have one shape which kind of just stops right here. And it's just, all the muscles are kind of the same in terms of, we don't have more muscles on the left than we do on the right. But here, everything flows. Everything flows nicely into each other. If you look at these ones, here's one shape like this. And everything works with each other. These are individual notes which works together to create harmony. Well, these are individual notes where each note tries to be as loud as humanly possible.
Yeah, it's like you're creating a full design per shape versus trying to create one whole shape from all of your tiny little parts.
We also have the same with the chest as well. This feels more like one shape like this with some individual variation, but this feels very much like different shapes coming together to just steal the show. These all wants to be the solo artist, and we can't have that. In a sculpture like this, it just doesn't work. Another thing I want you to look at as well is when it comes to the detail level, you want to make sure that you're thinking about spreading out detail or being deliberate where the details are. If we now look at his abs, this is the most detailed area on the entire model. Well, if you're looking on the left side, the abs section is pretty light on details. We don't want necessarily the stomach to be the focal point. The area where you put the most detail is most likely going to be the area you want to focus on. So make sure that everything is to the same level of refinement. You don't want this to be way more refined than everything else, but you also want to make sure that you don't have more detail in an area you don't want people to look at. We can also look at a lot of different things as well, which just makes them feel a bit weird. There are subtle things like his hands are they're a little bit smaller than on this one. The feet are a little bit smaller. If you look at the angle of his legs and thighs as well, we're going to see that here. They're starting from around here, and they were going outwards. Exaggerating a little bit now, just for sake of argument. And here, they're going more down. If you make them go down like this, it becomes very rigid. Then it's essentially the gesture of the leg becomes this. It just goes straight down. Well, here, the gesture becomes something more like this, and it goes into this shape. Then it goes something like this. So what is most interesting? This versus this shape. It's just so much more interesting if you were to angle something just a little bit like so as well.
It's again about creating variation. This here creates contrast in the shape. Contrast just meaning something that is different from whatever is around it, in the immediate area. Because on the character on the right, everything is straight up and down. There's no contrast in the gesture, whereas on the left, there's a lot more contrast because we have a lot of different shapes that sort of interlock.
Now let's look at some tapering as well. This is something that's incredibly important to consider when you are doing your designs. Specifically, we are looking at the arms. Arms generally tend to go from thick to thin. That's what we're seeing here, from thick to thin. So it goes something like this. Well, here it's almost a square, where it just feels a lot more organic. We're not saying you should do this for every single shape, because then it's just going to be thick to thin. And this is going to feel weird, but you have to be deliberate about it. Muscles going from thicker to thinner, and here it's just more of the same. Now, you can be more rigid with this if you're doing a more rigid design. If you're doing the Hulk, he's going to be more square than if you're doing like a ballerina, which is going to be more dynamic like this. But you still want to be deliberate about it. Even if you're doing more realistic shapes, like you're doing a more of a naturalistic figure study, you still want to think about tapering. Tapering should still very much be a part of your arsenal as an artist. It just helps you so much to create interesting shapes like this, from thick to thin.
The great thing about shape language like this is that it extends beyond individual muscles. Like you can see here, Henning, how he drew like the bicep, for example. Okay, so we've got some tapering in the bicep specifically, but the arm is comprised of more than just the bicep, right? We've got some of the tricep that sticks in there. The delt attaches as well. The forearm attaches. And that's one part of it. But then you can extend that even further to say, well, let's look at the tapering for the entire arm that extends down to the hand. Go even further and say, let's look at the tapering for the entire body. So you can look at this from like a macro and micro point of view and just really refine each single element until you have something that you feel really works.
And that's what we talked about, that appeal is the sum of all the design elements. And that means that you have to be good at each design element. So the better you are at understanding something like the tapering or the gesture, the better the overall character is going to be, and the more appealing your design is going to be.
That's why if someone has ever told you, or what you're trying to take away from this video is, how do I improve my, let's call it the ability of appeal, right? That's, you want to get more skill points in the appeal ability. You can only do that by leveling up in the sort of subcategories that make up appeal. Appeal isn't something that you just master. You have to get very, very good at all of the design elements that end up being appeal. And then the appeal in your character, environments, worlds, whatever it might be, will start to level up as well.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you're playing Skyrim and you're level 5 and you want to get level 6, you can't just level up. You have to do different specific things. You have to level up your axe or your sword fighting or your athletics and all that. And by adding those things up, your overall level will increase.
Yeah.
Where you are with appeal is a direct reflection of how good you are at. In this case, what we're talking about in this video is the gesture and shape variation and silhouette. So speaking of silhouette, let's look at silhouette. In order to change the silhouette in ZBrush, you can change the color to black, or you can also look at this guy up here. I just prefer to do it in black because then it's a bit easier to see. So silhouette here is obviously quite different. And let's take this into Photoshop to analyze it. We're seeing a lot of the things we've already talked about. Again, the silhouette is kind of like a reflection of all the other design elements as well. You don't necessarily just make the silhouette better. You're looking into the gesture, the internal gesture, tapering, making contrasting shapes, and that will directly improve the silhouette. But at some point, you also just got to look at the silhouette and you just got to do big changes to it. So stuff we're looking at right now, for instance, would be that if you notice the ear is missing. So we don't have the ear, and that's because the ear isn't gone. It's just that it's kind of like this. It's just right below it.
It's a subtle thing within the model that you might not pick up on just by looking at them side by side. But once you start looking at it in a silhouette view, you really start to pick up on the major differences, and especially things that you feel like could be improved.
We can also look at the arm as well. This shape goes something like this, and then it goes like that. And this shape kind of feels like it's one shape going across. So if you want to improve this, I would have taken the arm down like this and then moved the arm out like this, a little bit like so, just to create more interest. I would also move the head a bit forward as well. Just a longer neck is generally more appealing, and it also makes it a lot easier to animate. So if you have a character who doesn't really have a neck at all, it's very hard to actually animate this. Then we have the overall gesture, like we talked about. We really have to go in and like just change this up. We have to go in and just make this more interesting, like so. So we have to make more of a curve going across like this. And then we have to cut in like so as well. And we have to just refine it. Probably one of the biggest things is we have to just cut in like so, where we are, where his stomach is.
Yeah, the midsection there is really, it's messing up a lot of the shape.
It really is.
It just makes it not very good.
Then one thing as well, which is really problematic with this, is the balance. His feet are all the way back here. So if we just make a new layer, and we just start to analyze some of this. Now, if we take a line from here and all the way up, you can see where it is. If we take a line from here and up, you can see it's almost in the center of the model, which makes this guy just feel more balanced. This guy just feels really, really off balance. And that is one of these things which is hard to sometimes see. You're looking at your character and it just doesn't look right. And one of them could really be that he is terribly off balance. So what can we do with that? Well, we can move his legs a bit more forward. So his feet could be around here, and we can move this so he is something more like that. That would already make a huge difference. So we cannot state how important it is to look at the silhouette. We shouldn't just look at the silhouette just as just evaluate it. You should also look at the negative space as well. The negative space can be just as important as the positive space. So the negative space, that's everything that's in here. That's what we're looking at now, where we are looking at this shape like so. This shape, the negative space of this character is incredibly boring. See how it's just like a mushy thing where nothing really happens? Well, here it's a lot more interesting, a lot more refined. We can look at the negative space in these areas as well. Same thing here.
Especially when it comes to complex characters. Let's say characters with a lot of armor. The first thing that comes to mind is like a World of Warcraft kind of dwarf with a lot of heavy armor. The way that those things sort of overlap and create negative spaces next to each other, within each other, there it's really important to get this right, because the way that things overlap or sit next to each other can be kind of hard to evaluate when you're just looking at something that's lit, painted, and shaded. Whereas when you're looking at it as a silhouette, it makes it a lot easier to evaluate those spaces.
I find when I'm evaluating my negative space, it's not always just helpful to look at the overall big picture, but sometimes it's really handy to look at the smaller sections of negative space like so, where you can really see smaller chunks like this and evaluate them more locally instead of huge global changes. Because now you can really look at each individual shape and then improve each individual shape as a result of that. We would also, this is really annoying me, this part here. Now you can really just see how messed up this is. Like his legs are so far down, and you can start to improve it. You can start to actually paint on top of it, and you can start to fix this using only negative space or being in a silhouette view. You can start to paint in black on top of it. And this is how I often design. I design it first in ZBrush, then I take it into Photoshop, and I just straight up draw over the silhouette, because here you're not constrained by poly counts or polygons or anything like this. And you can just go in and you can just really start to do big, broad strokes to just refine your design significantly. So this really sums up the video for now. We have been talking about global gesture, which is the overall flow of the entire model. We're talking about internal gesture, which is more how muscles flow into each other. You don't necessarily have to think about it as anatomy, but more all shapes should really work together. The shapes, the flow of this muscle should come into this muscle, and they should just work as one cohesive unit. We've been talking about shape variation, such as tapering, making something go from thick to thin, having contrasted shapes, such as having round shapes combined with square shapes. And then we also talked about negative space and the silhouette. So we really hope this here helps your sculpting. And if you want to learn more about this, we have the newly released Introduction to Sculpting series out now. So we really hope you'll check that out, and good luck to you in your sculpting.
Thank you guys so much for watching.